Okay, well, you've had three very good presentations so far, and I'm in the unenviable position of having to follow them. What I would like to do in the time that I have is address a little bit why the so-called deal of the century is so inadequate. And I agree with what's been said by previous speakers that it's almost an insult to have to address its shortcomings. But for those of you who perhaps aren't so familiar with it, I think it might be useful to provide a brief overview of what exactly is so wrong with it. And secondly, after doing that, I'd like to look into why this deal has been proposed when it is, on the face of it, unimplementable and unworkable even on its own terms. And I'm going to suggest that this is ultimately, as Joseph Massad has said as well, a kind of culmination of a much longer running agenda by Israel, by the Zionist political movement more generally, of dismantling the Palestinian national movement and of denying the existence of a Palestinian people with national identity and rights. So let's start with the plan's shortcomings. And of course, here I'm talking about the economic package that was revealed recently. Has anybody, just out of curiosity, by a show of hands, has anyone read it or read the executive summary? Okay, so very few of you, and I wouldn't really recommend it, the others, to read it. It's absolutely, apart from anything else, weird. It reads like a kind of glossy brochure inviting kind of investment from the international business community. So I'll tell you some of the things that it lacks. It has absolutely no mention of the context. So it doesn't even acknowledge that there is a conflict, that there is an occupation. There is no analysis whatsoever as to why the Palestinian economy is weak. And because it doesn't analyze why the Palestinian economy is suffering, it also doesn't propose any solutions that would actually solve the problems of the Palestinian economy. We know, of course, it's been divorced from any political settlement, so it has no political vision. It mentions no political objectives. There's no mention of a Palestinian state or of any kind of resolution of the conflict between Israel or the Palestinians. It doesn't even acknowledge that there is a political problem that requires resolution. And it also doesn't make clear who will implement the plan or how it will be implemented. So, for example, there's no mention, and Joseph has mentioned this already, of the Palestinian Authority as being a partner in implementing this plan, or of Israel in implementing it. There's sort of talk vaguely of the business community and of the Palestinian private sector. It mentions various proposals and schemes to provide, for example, technical assistance to help Palestinians deal with trade more efficiently, or to help facilitate academic exchange and visiting professors from outside of Palestine coming to Palestinian universities, without any mention of the fact that, of course, none of those things can occur without Israel's approval and cooperation, which until now hasn't been forthcoming. So Palestinians can't trade, not because they lack technical expertise, but because Israel blocks Palestinian trade. Academics from around the world cannot go and do stints in Palestinian universities, not because they don't want to, but because Israel doesn't provide visas and often denies them entry or deports academics. So basically, to sum it up, without going into it in any more depth, it's a glossy brochure that has no relationship with reality at all, as far as I can tell. It's completely divorced from reality and doesn't even purport to provide any context. And it's, got all of these practical problems like who are the people who will implement it, where is the money coming from, which means that it doesn't seem to be workable even on its own terms, right? Now, the second question is, some people might argue, well, what about if these things were tweaked or in some way these obstacles were overcome and partners were found and there was a practical way of implementing it? Would it solve the problems of the Palestinian economy? And again, I don't think I need to labor the point, but the answer is obviously no. The reason that the Palestinian economy is suffering isn't because there's a lack of business kind of investment or private sector stimulation. It's because of the occupation and the fact that Palestinians lack sovereignty over their land and their natural resources, and they lack control over their economic activity. That much is obviously, I'm sure, very clear to all of us. But just to give a couple of examples, so the 1994 Paris Protocol, which was part of the Oslo Accords, for example, imposed an unequal customs union on Israel and the Palestinian territories, granted Israeli businesses direct access to Palestinian markets, but restricted the entry of Palestinian goods into Israel. It gave Israel control over tax collection. It entrenched the use of the shekel in the West Bank and Gaza, which means that the Palestinian Authority could not impose fiscal policy or any macroeconomic policies. Israel, of course, also has physical control over Palestinian land, resources, and economic activity. So, for example, 35% of Gaza's arable land, farmland, which ordinarily would be farmed, could create goods that could be exported that would generate revenue, is in an Israeli-imposed buffer zone. That means Palestinian farmers who try to access their land often get targeted with live fire. Israel also periodically sprays pesticides on Gazan arable land, killing crops that are grown there. So, for example, in 1 month, January 2018, the losses as a result of this pesticide spraying amounted to $1.3 million. We know in the West Bank that Israel controls Area C, which is most of the land and natural resources of the West Bank, including most of the cultivatable land. And it's estimated that as a result of Israel denying Palestinians access to Area C, this costs the Palestinian economy something like in the order of $480 million per year. So the point here is obviously no economic plan that doesn't address these problems can possibly alleviate the harm that is happening to the Palestinian economy or stimulate the Palestinian economy in any meaningful way. No people, no country can possibly have true economic development without having sovereignty over their land and their natural resources and their economic activity. So a plan that doesn't address these issues, doesn't seek to alleviate any of them, is obviously completely unworkable and is a non-starter. Now, I want to just use the rest of my time, which is, how much time do I have left? 3 minutes. Great. To quickly run through why then is this plan being proposed. I don't know whether Jared Kushner and those around him actually believe it's workable or not. I would rather not inquire into their state of mind. But I think it's clear, regardless of whether people think it might work, it won't. And I think it's obviously part of a broader agenda of paying lip service to Palestinian concerns, whilst very importantly giving again Israel that space and that time that it's had ever since the beginning of the Oslo process to continue its program of colonization of Palestinian land and suppression of Palestinian rights, and ensure zero accountability to Israel, zero context which allows people to understand that the Palestinian economy is struggling because of Israel's restrictions and occupation. So I think that much is obvious to all of us. But I think, and I wanted to end by saying, I think it's also promoting another agenda, which is something, again, which is part more broadly of Israel's ambitions, which is, I think it is part of an agenda of further atomizing Palestinians, breaking them up into, at best, individual communities, each of which have different kinds of aspirations at most, and breaking down the concept that Palestinians are a people, they are a group with national rights, with a national identity, and with therefore a connection to land and rights in a particular land. So why do I say that? I think if you read the plan itself, it reads like a kind of neoliberal, kind of reformist plan. You know, Palestinians are kind of treated as these sort of individual consumers who will be the recipients of investment, and the business community will drive the economy and the like. So already it fits into a kind of slightly broader neoliberal kind of sense of atomization, which we see not only in Israel, Palestine, but in other places too. And beyond that, we know it's coupled with, we don't know what the political part of the plan is yet, but we know that the noises that the US has been making over the last 2 years, it's clear that all of the main demands of the Palestinian national movement will not be fulfilled in any US-sponsored plan. So Trump has already moved the embassy to Jerusalem, signaling no joint capital between Israel and Palestine. It's already clear there won't be a Palestinian state at the end of this. And the refugees, and this is something I wanted to highlight, I find particularly interesting. Some of you may remember about 18 months ago, the US defunded UNRWA, stopped giving money to the UN Refugee Agency, and it also, importantly, started to say that the problem, why there was a refugee problem, is not because Israel hasn't allowed the refugees home, but because UNRWA keeps registering descendants of refugees as also refugees. And I thought this was very puzzling, because how does it make sense to object to the notion that a refugee population's children and grandchildren, great-grandchildren, so long as they remain refugees and stateless, would continue to be registered as such? Well, I think it only makes sense to object to that if one is trying, in fact, to imply that the Palestinians don't constitute a national group. Because if they're not a national group, children don't inherit the nationality of their parents. They're just these kind of atomized individuals who, if you're born as a stateless refugee in Lebanon, you should sort of wake up one day and be a Lebanese person, and not have the connection to your parents' nationality and therefore your parents' homeland. So what I'm trying to say in a roundabout way is that I see this plan as also the culmination of a broader attempt to break down the notion of a Palestinian collectivity, to break down the notion that there is such a thing as a Palestinian people with a group identity, and rather they will become, Palestinians will be at most atomized and individual and sort of recipients, like I said, of this neoliberal order. And why is it important to deny Palestinian peoplehood? Because if you're a people, that's why you have a right to self-determination. And if you have a right to self-determination, you have national rights, those attached to a particular territory, all or part of historic Palestine. And as we know, the objectives of the Zionist movement, of course, is to colonize all of historic Palestine and to deny any connection between the Palestinian people and that same territory. So to me, these are the way that all of these things link up. This is about fragmentation. It's about denying national identity to the Palestinians, ultimately. And what's the response, therefore? Well, I've run out of time, I'm sure. I think ultimately, and this has been touched on by the other speakers, you know, we are where we are, and I hate to say it, and it saddens me to say it, because the Palestinian movement is weak, and it is kind of a sign of being weak and in a state of temporary, let's say, defeat, that such a plan could be contemplated and potentially imposed. And, you know, I think Joseph has said this and others have said this. At the end of the day, no amount of saying, we are Palestinians, we are a people, we have national rights to this territory is going to make it happen. These things have to be struggled for, they have to be fought for. And I'm mindful of the fact that I'm standing in an auditorium in London comfortably saying this, not risking my life or the life of my children or my loved ones in the way that people in the West Bank and Gaza Strip are. But I think it's incumbent upon us as Palestinians and our supporters to realize that the only way to deal with this is to fight, is to bring that fight in whichever way possible. Thanks very much.